Thank you all for joining us today. This is episode 3 of the OmniPotential Series. And the OmniPotential Series is one of the Hold On Institute's kind of first forays into sharing ourselves and sharing our work and introducing some of the kind of animating and core principles that drive the work that we're doing. And specifically our ethos of emergent possibility through embodied imagination. And so the OmniPotential series is unpacking each of those words, and we're going through each one individually to explore what does that even mean? What's behind that word? Why did we choose it? And why is it representative of what we believe to be a fundamental ontological shift, if you will, at a foundational level in terms of how we conceive of ourselves as people, how we conceive of our relationship to the world around us, and how we operate and occupy our spaces, environments, communities, etc., in service to a shared prosperous future for all of human life and the more than human world. So that's what this is. Today we're talking about through, and I'm super excited to talk with Tina, who is one of our co-founders at the Hold On Institute. Tina has a spectacular background and just comprehensive depth in a lot of various healing modalities, and I had the pleasure of working with Tina on crafting a 5-week learning program around spiral dynamics. And there's just Tina is constantly somebody that I'm learning from. And so I think that this conversation is going to be a great conversation, and we'll invite you all into it as well. It's the end to unpack what does it mean to be through, to go through something, because we're all going through something. And what does that even mean to be? Is it to be in, to be through, to be out, to be over, to be under, right? We're trying desperately to use metaphor and language to get at something. And it sometimes can be difficult to get at that thing. And so that's what we want to unpack today. And there's a few reasons why we think that this topic of living through, or the concept of throughness, is important. And one of the reasons is because we live in a culture that was built on this notion of manifest destiny, right? This culture of growth and ascension and getting better, improvement, right? Self-improvement. And so there's this idea that progress looks like vertical ascension, right? All of the charts that you see people pointing to when they're talking about improvement or progress go up into a direction. And there's something about through that it contradicts that idea in a nuanced way. That maybe through doesn't look as linear up in one direction. Maybe it's up a little bit and then down a lot, and maybe it's around in circles, and maybe there's other dimensions and directions of what it means to live through, and that perhaps our best and our wellness and our health and our integration and our connection and our dreams and our love and our fears and aspirations and all of these things are more intimately encountered in the throughness of life rather than the overness of life, trying to overcome the things that we're facing, overcome the challenges. Maybe we need to descend. Maybe there's a journey to Hades before there's a journey to the golden promised land. One more thing, and then we'll jump into this, that I learned this week. I was at a dinner, and a friend of mine is starting this chamber of connection, as he's calling it, instead of a chamber of commerce. And he said, one of the best ways to make a connection with another person is to ask for help. Oh, that's interesting. And so I think that as we're talking about this topic of through, and we're talking about the things that we're going through, that this really does become really critical as a conversation to community, and really critical to shared, the coalition of the willing, so to speak, and the ability to activate collective action for transformation. It's going to require throughness, and it's going to require togetherness. So this is a very important topic to us. And with that, maybe let's just dive in, and Tina and I will chat for a little bit. And then, as always, please drop questions into the chat if you have them, and we'll get to them. Tina, we've been going back and forth the last couple of weeks on through quite a bit, and there's so much here to get to and to try and begin unpacking. But can you maybe help us contextualize or tether the notion of through just conceptually so that we can have a common shared starting place to build from.
Yeah, and thank you for that whole introduction, Joel, and setup for everybody. I can guarantee that I do not have as polished of a presentation that we got from Dr. Thies last week, so we'll definitely be able to get to your questions. So please be a part of this conversation. I think of all the words that we have, emergent, possibility, through, embodied, imagination, through is the most ambiguous and could go in the most variety of directions, probably. I don't know. We could go around about that, but through doesn't mean one thing, right? And through has just as real of definitions in the physical world, the biological world, the emotional, the mental, the spiritual, etc. And so for this purpose, if I were to really think about through with regard to the other set of language that we've put before and after it for hold on, I think the through really is the internal transformational process that is required of one or required of any community, organization, group of people to make that internal shift. Ken Wilber talks about in his 4 quadrants, he talks about the internal experience of the individual, the internal experience of a group, and then the externally understandable experience of an individual and the externally understandable experience of a group. So if we think about through as really the internal side of both, I think that's really helpful because I can't look at Joel and say, I could say Joel is going through it if Joel tells me I'm going through it, or if Joel says I'm deep in an emotional experience right now or whatnot, I might be able to label something, but I can inevitably never know what Joel's through feels like. And I think with that, it's a very interesting thing because to some extent, as humans, we have a shared experience of through. And at the same time, we can never really know what somebody else's through is. So if we take it up another layer, I'd say a commonality is, from my own perspective, if you're really allowing yourself to be undone, and then eventually with time, with support, with practices, with an understanding shift, allowing yourself to be remade or to remake oneself out the other side, to me, that's really the through that we're talking about. It's not just, hey, an emotional storm has descended upon us or something from the outside world that we didn't have control over has happened. That's an invitation into through. But whether or not we accept that invitation, I think is the big clarifying moment here, because life happens in one way or another. Someone we love gets diagnosed with terminal cancer. Something devastating happens to a loved one. A relationship ends, a job ends, or on the other side of things, and I've known people whose awakening experiences have come from huge lightness as well. You have a psychedelic experience, you experience oneness, and you try to make sense of it afterwards. You have a baby, you get a giant opportunity that you don't feel like you're entirely ready for. So I think in either direction, we can be prompted to go through, but then the willingness to go through, I think, is it's a different energy. And I think we all probably, if I said, hey, let's all take 3 minutes right now and write down 5 people in your life who've been invited to go through, but are refusing, I think those names would come off you pretty quickly, because those are the people who call you or sit down with coffee, and they might even say, I need help or I need support, but you're on the same freaking hamster wheel that you've been on with them every other time you've had coffee in the last 6 months, a year, 6 years. They're having the same complaints, they're having the same issues, there's the same level of disempowerment. You might feel extreme empathy. It's not saying that they're not going through a very real human experience, but would you say they've accepted the invitation to go through? Probably not. So I think that's where I start with all this, is that it's that entering into the fire that, of course, there's a lot of spiritual metaphor around. There's a lot of people who do walking the Camino, people who decide to climb Mount Everest. There's many ways that people go into 10-day silent meditation retreat, many ways that people want to take an invitation to go in and to go through. And there's many different ways that looks. But at the end of the day, it's the willingness to enter into a co-creative transformational experience with oneself, where you know you will end up fundamentally different on the other side, and you do not have control of that person who emerges. You just know that you have to be participatory in that process so that you can emerge as your new self on the other side.
Hmm. I love the language of invitation and how you framed that. There's an invitation, and it comes down to us being willing to respond. And I'm curious, like that example that you gave, the person they're dealing with the same thing over and over again. So the invitation is there. Maybe they don't know it, but how do you recognize the invitation? And could you characterize what the invitation feels like so that we can recognize it? And what might be some of the things that we have to overcome in accepting the invitation to go through?
One of my, and you might need to reel me back in because there's like a bunch of different directions we can go. So I'm
Yep.
going to try to hit each of those, but if I
Okay.
miss one of them, please replace me. So one of my favorite ways to think about this is if when a chick, a baby chick, is in the egg still, it reaches, before it emerges, it reaches its maximum amount of waste that will be in that egg with them in that container, and its least amount of food. So by the time that it has to start pecking its way out, it has amassed the most waste and the least generative resource for it to keep living. And so there's something within it that knows, and I can never know the first person experience of a baby chick. I don't know if it's terrifying. I don't know if it's completely natural. I have no idea, but peck it goes and it breaks the shell from the inside out. That is new life. However, if we see an egg and we decide it's time, that chick should be coming out, and it hasn't started pecking, and we break it, chances are that means death. And we break the egg from the outside, we're ending something that's not in a generative manner. And if we allow it to break itself from the inside out, so the question becomes, and I can't keep taking this along the train because I don't know if you recognize that the egg needs help, but do you put it in a warmer? I don't. So we'll end that here, but I will say as a human, that I think is the trickiest thing. That is the hardest thing, as watching one's own journey and trying to get better at this process over time. I know that's my own personal commitment to myself, to Trace as my life partner, and to the collective as a whole, is how can I sense when a through is inviting me in the earliest whispers of that through, so that I can meet that transformation with as much grace and as much presence and as many supportive practices, as many supportive people, whatever that is, so that I actually am very willing to go through that. And I've learned that the first time I ever had to go through such transformation about a decade ago, that came with one of those classic, there's a feeling in the body, I can't do this anymore. I was ending a marriage, and it was bathroom on floor crying. It was drama. It was hysterics. It was a lot of things. I had never broken the facade before that. Prior to that, I had just gone on that linear trajectory of doing what I was expected to do. And don't get me wrong, I don't think 100% of anybody is only doing what they're expected to do. Like, we're participatory in that. So I'm making choices along the way. And I'm not going to say that version of myself was making all bad choices by any stretch. I was just making choices that contained some larger amount of what was expected of me or conditioned in me than what my soul wanted of me. And so eventually, that ability to hold that percentage, whatever it was, of my true self versus what's expected of me, broke. And it really allowed me to recognize that undoing process is happening for me, but I had to go through it myself the first time. I don't think I would have taken from anybody else, hey, this is happening for you. I don't know, maybe I would have, who knows? But I do think there's a musculature to all of this where we get better with it, we get more comfortable with it, we learn how to face, because I think one of the biggest things is that the emotions that weren't as easily allowed, or maybe not allowed at all in our childhood experience, those become, if you are interested in internal family systems, we use the language exiles. But the bottom line is they become parts of us that we don't relate to. I'm not somebody who rages. I'm not somebody who has shame. I'm not somebody who this, that, the other thing. And so when those emotions come through, we have no empathy in those emotions for others because we don't recognize them in ourselves. And so there's this whole reclaiming process of both who we truly are and also the totality of the emotional experience. And I don't think those two things can be separate, but there's a leading up to a belief shift that life is happening for me instead of life is happening to me. And I would describe it as the wounded ego, or the more conditioned persona that thinks life is happening to me. And therefore, each subsequent thing that happens is more proof that life is happening to me. And we all know people who have built their entire persona around, I am just constantly victimized, and each subsequent thing that happens is just more proof of that, versus actually we're the ones who came here to do these things, to learn through these things and grow through these things. And as a matter of fact, without the very hardest of the things that have been presented to me in my life, I would not be who I am. And I can say that with full confidence. When I have to talk about, or when I choose to talk about some of the most challenging relational things that have happened, I'm very clear that's how I gained my empowerment. That's how I know I'll never abandon myself again. That's how I know what forgiveness truly is, or grace is, or unconditional love is. I don't think we learn the top end of the spectrum without making peace with the really hard and dark end. And so I think that's how I would describe that. Now, as far as the portion about like, how do we know how to invite somebody else into that? I think
Before you jump
it's
into that,
so, yeah, I was just gonna say, it's feeling and sensing that something that we can't even like necessarily put a lot of language around.
yeah. So there's a bunch of stuff that you said that I want to point out specifically because I think it's really important. And one of the things you said earlier was this, you used the word whisper, which to
Mm,
me insinuates something that's hard to notice or hear without being quiet and still.
mm,
And so maybe there's a precondition to accepting the invitation to through is quietness and stillness, like the actual ability to hear yourself and your own thoughts and to be present with that part of you, right? And maybe it's the part of you that was the exile who is screaming for attention, to be heard, to be seen, to be affirmed, right? The part of you that had to be smothered to survive, maybe
mhm,
previously, right? The part of
mhm,
you that, if it was in the driver's seat, would have been highly destructive, but still needs to be integrated into the greater whole.
mhm,
And so there's something about this to accept the invitation is to be still so that you can recognize the slow motion whisper that is coming from in you. And to Anu's point in the chat, like enough is enough. There's something about a
mhm,
willingness to accept the cost, whatever it might be, of saying yes to the invitation to go through.
mhm,
And you only can get there by being actually in tune with yourself to some degree. And I think that there's this, in saying yes to through, you're saying yes to the part of yourself that is saying enough is enough.
mhm,
So there is a connection here for me in, are you being honest and true to you? And that becomes a question about whether or not you're willing to go through something.
mhm,
Because when you're willing to go through something, you're essentially saying, I'm going to get at root causes. I'm not going to keep treating or coping symptoms.
mhm,
Yep. And so there's this hospitality extended to a part of yourself who wants something different,
Mhm.
or a part of yourself that's going to help you survive.
Mhm.
Because maybe what you're going through is extremely oppressive or repressive and difficult and challenging. There's so many people around the world today who are going through such immense suffering.
Mhm.
It's absolutely insane. Which leads me to my next question, which is, even if we're not, and this is direct, I think where you were starting to go with some things here in terms of going through things together, even if you're not going through something hyper traumatic yourself in this moment,
Mhm.
we are constantly inundated with images and sound bites and headlines of other people going through it, right? And to be in relationship with somebody who's going through it. There's a, through the pandemic, there was a term coined by sociologists called collective cascading trauma. And basically, it's this idea that there's secondhand trauma, that when
Mhm.
you are exposed to the suffering of others in such a prolific and constant way, that your body begins to actually hold that energy, even if cognitively you don't recognize that it's there. And so, how do we live through that? Like, how do we operate on a day-to-day basis in the midst of this collective cascading trauma that we're all participating in to some degree? What does that look like? How do we do it in a resilient way? How do we support each other? How do we not succumb to the overwhelm and the anxiety and the depression and right? Do you have any reflections or wisdom for us on just living through this craziness this time?
Yeah, a few different directions with this one. So the first one is I've personally been through the experience of having secondhand PTSD. So this was boyfriend at the time's father was engaged in a murder suicide. And so years later, relationship had ended, and I could not get through speaking about this experience, my emotions, any of it, without being in absolute hysterics and feeling like it was all happening in that moment again. So what I learned from that, first of all, I cannot recommend Body Keeps the Score, the book, enough. And at that point in time, I used it like an oracle. And so I just opened up the page and it happened to be a chapter on EMDR. I'm like, that's the next stop. This is where we're going. And this is back when not that many people were talking about EMDR and doing it. I think it's a lot more common now. So I bring this up to say that I truly believe that secondhand PTSD is very real. I was not co-located with the people that this was happening to at the time, and still from a couple thousand miles away, I had the very visceral experience of years later carrying this trauma. And so I'm never going to deny that secondhand PTSD is definitely a thing. And also, I think we got a really beautiful gift, not surprisingly, serendipitously, from Tracy, my therapist, this morning. She was describing that when people are on some level of constant fight or flight, or even fawn or freeze, so nervous system is sympathetic and dysregulated, she talks about us as having two gas tanks. And I guess we'll call them batteries. We'll up level their sustainability. And so battery one is our regular day-to-day battery. It's the one we talk about when we say, put your own oxygen mask on first and then help others. It's the one we say, pour out to others from a full cup. That's our regular day-to-day battery that we're talking about, can have any level of use or not use during a day. And your typical self-care, your 10-minute meditation in the morning, or your 20 minutes of quiet time before bed, reading a book, is sufficient to fill that up. And your regular exercise, whatever, you're doing pretty well with your regular battery. But when we go into being, for some period of time, it doesn't even have to be longer than a couple days, and this can be on behalf of somebody else, when we tap into that second battery, when that first battery is completely drained and we go to our backup battery, any amount of that battery draining is, and any actions we take from that place are in that area of adrenal response, fight or flight, some level of panic or terror, It's just bottom line. Number one, it's not physically sustainable for ourselves. We're not built to live. The second battery's there for survival. It's not there for a method to live on. And the reason I bring up these two batteries is I feel like it just gives a really good picture in if you currently are feeling like world events, for example, maybe it's the election, maybe it's what's happening in Israel and Gaza, and maybe it's whatever, we could name all the things. But if you are not personally involved, it's not your work to be working for the campaign, you don't have family members in Palestine or whatnot, I think it requires us to ask a brave question of what am I doing to contribute to the positive energetic turning of humanity during this time? And is it really healthy for me to engage in these things that are by choice? And so I think what I'm pointing to and saying, do you have a direct family member there, or is this your work or whatnot, is I get it if you don't, that is some people's secondhand trauma right now, period. But for everybody else who is not, it is not lazy, it is not sticking your head in the sand, it is not unloving to question how plugged into these things that are causing you to feel like you are part of this collective cascading trauma. How healthy is that for you to keep plugging into those things if it means you're out of your first battery and you're into your second one? Because that also means you're not good for your daily life. You're not sustaining your own health for yourself. You have to be in your first battery to be sustaining your health. You have to be in your first battery to be sustaining your loved ones, your children, your partner, your aging parents, your job, whatever all those things are. And so if all of us take world events and then that flips us into our second battery, that's actually how we become controlled. Because people who are afraid and people who have no energy and people who are on constant adrenaline and cortisol are sick. They don't have life force energy. They're manipulatable. Conspiracy theories go flying really fast because it's all. And so we become those who are controlled by the very media that we want to change what they're reporting on, and not just the content, but like the systems behind the content and the systems behind the systems. And so that's the whole thing that Holon wants to engage in. And so I would say, if you want to be like we want to be, and this is very real for us, we're grappling with this daily, but if you want to be part of contributing to the positive trajectory of the transformation of humanity and this planet and where our systems are going, then you have to let go of the things that are pulling from your emergency battery, unless it's actually truly personal that your emergency battery is needed, and you have to work on your first battery. And from that place of working on your first battery, then get really clear what your role is in this collective transformation that we're undergoing.
Yeah, that's good. Can you speak to spiritual bypassing? Because this is a phrase, I think you introduced me to this phrase, and I think it's an interesting concept in as much as it relates back to, I'll let you explain it because I think I'm gonna just mess it up if I try to.
Yeah, and I'm loving the comments, so I want to make sure to get to those
Yeah,
as well.
we'll get.
Yeah, absolutely. So spiritual bypassing is this concept where, and this is a tricky one, because especially in the Western world, we have so been trained to live in our heads, live in our logic, live in our cognition from a mental perspective, not a holistic perspective. It actually, again, back to being fear and controlled. The more disembodied we are, the better basically workers we became, right? And we're controlled and et cetera, et cetera. So in order to reclaim our full selves, part of what we need to reclaim is our interconnection to everything that is. It is very hard to desire to go murder people, extract from the planet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when you are fully embodied and feel the physical sensations, feel the empathy, all of it that comes from living from all of our sensing. They say the field of the heart is up to 20 feet out measurable, and the field of the head is only about 6. If we are disconnected from that, then it actually makes it a lot easier to turn us into consumers and everything else. So where spiritual bypassing comes in is it's this very tricky thing, because on the one hand, we're given this plot where we all have to start in these academic environments and we become heads on a stick and we're just using this brain and we're just using part of this brain, by the way. And so reintegrating our connection to all that is very critically important. But the trick is, and this goes a bit to Liz's comment, we are a part of a dualistic system. We are inevitably a part of the yin yang, the sun and the moon, the tides ebbing and flowing. And so part of that is that we are both human beings and spiritual beings at the exact same time. We are both connected to all that is, one with all that is, if you will, and also individuated into bodies. And so to be only one or the other of those is very problematic. Most of us started as just being bodies. And that's the fundamental problem that we have in our current system, is that we think we're all just separate. We're all fighting for survival. We've forgotten our interconnection. But then if we swing to the other polarity and set up shop there, then that's where people become disembodied in a different direction. They enjoy the experience of feeling one with all that is, and maybe they're using spiritual tools or techniques to get to that sensation and that feeling, and that's healthy to build that muscle. But if we set up camp there, and then someone walks up to me and is, oh, by the way, my son died of cancer, and I'm like, he's in a better place, or like, a cancer on one of us is a cancer on all of us. It's just like, don't be a dick. And so and I think we can all sense this pull in a way, that as we start reintegrating the truth that we are all one, we can get to a place where, what does it all matter? Maybe all the wars are supposed to be playing out. Maybe everything is happening as it's supposed to happen. And on some level, maybe yes, I don't know. I'm not source. I'm not God. I'm not the universe. I don't know. But I think we can fundamentally understand and live into our connection and one with all that is, and also understand that there's a very good reason we incarnated. But it's once we come back out of those two polarities and we reintegrate all of it, we realize we are spiritual beings having a human experience. The human experience that we've chosen to have matters. Us as co-creators matters. What we choose to create while we're here matters. The lessons that we decide to do, partake in, I like to call them virtues, but however people like to talk about, the patience that we cultivate, the forgiveness, the compassion, the unconditional love, those things matter. I truly believe that even in the amount of time that I've been journeying, the amount of positive ripple effect that I've been able to generate compared to the person who I was before I went through it, and I don't know, maybe neutral ripple effect at best. I was trying, I'm not going to say I wasn't trying, but something tells me that it was probably negative ripple effect, because anybody who's burnt out and thinks they're only here to go work in their cubicle and blah, 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 loveless marriage, you're not adding positively to society or to oneself or to the people directly around you. And so I do think that the going through it all of the way, like, yes, we have to get to the place where we do fully understand and embody that what happens to you happens to me and all of us, and that we're all in this grand cosmic play together. And also then come back with that full knowledge and understanding into my body and ask, what role am I here to play?
Yeah. So I'm going to try and say back what I'm hearing you say. Tell me if I'm getting this right. Spiritual bypassing is the tendency to adopt a position or posture that is indexed on there's some grand plan at play. Therefore, the suffering of your moment is trivialized because it's all going to be fine. Like, I grew up in a Christian home, so it was God works all things for those. Maybe some of you have heard that, right? That's the kind of thing, right? And we can do that with all sorts of stuff. We can even do that with astrology or with things like wisdom traditions like the Enneagram, or, oh, I'm just a blank, whatever your type is or whatever. So that's whatever. That's just me being me. And so that doesn't mean it's healthy or good. And so we can use spiritual or quasi-spiritual or quasi-wisdom ideas to excuse ourselves from answering the invitation to through, which
Mm.
requires that we maybe put some of those ideas on the shelf for a moment. And I think the other thing that I hear you saying is the duality piece, back to what Liz mentioned here, it's not just have gratitude for all things all the time for everything. And it's not just dwell in this space of sorrow, mourning, and grief, but
Mhm.
it's actually we have to hold both of those things simultaneously. That we need to hedge against spiritual bypass. We need to hold our grief and our gratitude together, right? That like I can have grief for the suffering that I'm going through right now. I can have grief for the suffering of the world around me. And I can
Mhm.
also have gratitude for these things and the beauty of this and the awe of that, right? And that those things aren't mutually exclusive. And maybe going through increases our capacity to hold the tension and paradox of grief and gratitude.
Mhm.
So the last thing I want to ask you, Tina, and then we'll get to some of these comments and questions is there another side? Do we come through and out to something else and new? Or are we just in perpetual throughness?
Mm.
Is there ever a change? What happens on the other side of through, if there even is another side?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I love the way that you summarized all of that with regard to spiritual bypassing. I think that was beautiful. Yeah, we do get out the other side, and we're always in perpetual throes. It's both. So I feel like there are many helpful ways of seeing this. For one, I think over time, as I've continued to walk through and take invitations through and learn how to dance with through differently, I really do love the saying that it's a spiral path. And just if you were to spiral up a mountain, you might think you're seeing the same thing over and over, but it is from different vistas.
Mm,
And so I think that there's definitely, at least in my lived experience, a truth to that. And over time, what I've been able to see as I've hit enough of those vistas is I can now name them. Oh, yeah, this is me with some abandonment energy that for whatever reason I came into this lifetime to experience and to bring healing to, and probably bring healing to over and over again. And could I label it with a bunch of stories from childhood, which might feel true or might feel not? Could I put past life stuff on it? Could I put epigenetic stuff on it? Sure. But at some point in time, it's just helpful to be like, oh, abandonment, my old friend. You're great. You're fine. You're with your spirit team, which for me brings a ton of comfort because it's been relationships that I've cultivated personally with the knowingness that I'm never alone. So I think there's an element of that, which is like the more we can name and in the simplest terms possible, like least amount of story, most amount of accuracy of, hey, these are the handful of things that obviously I came into this life to visit with and to learn and to become really intimate with. It just tends to help then because, oh, I'm getting another invitation to through. Oh, I see that it's about this again. Oh, and then it becomes that you're in on the cosmic joke before the whole unraveling even has to happen. And I found at times that, and through this process, because the beginning throughs can be so hard, I became spiritually paranoid.
mm,
If I sense things soon enough, I can take care of them soon enough and avoid going through like the worst of it. So again, all of this is so tricky because we all have egos that are here to protect us. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And so part of my learning through all that is to laugh at that now, because now I see as I've continued on my journey, some things had to wallop me like a boulder. And I'm like, oh yeah, I now that you walloped me like a boulder, I see you have been kind of winking at me for the last 35 years. But only now did it get bad enough or clear enough or whatever enough for me to actually be like, okay, here's the time that I actually can dance with you and work with you and change and allow myself to be undone with you and remade with you. And so that's gonna happen for those of us with aging parents, for example. Like, our parents will pass. And so, in other words, some of us can see and already know where some of these places are going to be really challenging. And then there's other things that happen that are completely unexpected. And there's no amount of getting ahead of the energy that you ever could have done to change it. And then a majority, I'd say those are the exceptions, right? They're the really big hunker ones, but they're the exceptions. I think a majority of life is giving us constant whispers, constant invitations, with so much more grace, with so many more co-creative, cooperative supporters, etc., to help us navigate something. Everything from meditation practices and journaling, or I particularly like using oracle cards. Like, there's however we get to that whisper, however we make that whisper louder, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. Like, the more often we can do that, and for me it's become a daily practice, and not from a place of fear. I think, again, when we're talking about these things, does it feel like I'm approaching through from as much of a place of love as I can? I think it's the fear that prevents us from actually going through and transforming. But if I really bring the energy in to go through with love, then there's a part of me that knows that I will have plenty of resource to get through. And as a matter of fact, there'll probably be some magic and serendipity along the way to help me through. It's the kicking and the screaming and the fear, which isn't true. I remember how much my life changed when I realized it's all love. This whole thing, we're floating around in a substrate of love. And if I can align myself to knowing that it's all love, those moments come with so much more ease, so much more synchronicities, manifestation opportunity, however you want to say, visionary, so much more peace, calm, the things that we do want. So to your question of, is there another side to it? Yes. It's the side where we have way more love in our bodies. On a cellular level, we truly have purged the energies, because unfelt emotions, unprocessed emotions do live in our bodies. And that's next week's embodiment. But we really can have a place where we are so much more a battery of love than we are a battery of fear. And that fear battery just drains and drains and tries to drain everyone around it. And it just is exhausting. And so I think that the gift of through is more love. And so then, as we have more throughs, we have more love. And that becomes the engine that makes the entire experience feel so incredibly different than if we're coming from a place of fear.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna comment on a couple things, but Tina, while I'm doing that, if you wanted to scroll through the comments and come back to anything, and then also if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment, you can either unmute yourself and raise your hand, or just start talking, or drop it in the comments. We've got about 8 minutes or so to chat through questions. A couple things in here that I think are really interesting. One is Chris's comment about releasing judgment, I think is really phenomenal. And I would say to not judge your emotional experience, but also to not judge the emotional experience of others. I think that it's easy for some of these things. There's some nuance here, and that there's almost an ableism that can be introduced into this, especially in the kind of the space that we occupy of systems transformation and self-transformation and growth and expansion and consciousness theory and all these things. There's sometimes an ableist tone to some of these things, in the sense that if you can't accept the invitation, then you're not doing it as good. And so it's hard to, we have to be, I think, just careful and sensitive to some of that. And then I think the other thing, it's really important to acknowledge, is what Jason mentioned up above around indigenous communities and the trauma of colonialism and imperialism, and to even extend that to things like patriarchy and other power systems that have been oppressive historically. that there's a lot of complexity there often, but in some cases it is just pretty straightforward and simple. There's been damage done and it's been violent, and there's a lot of complicity. And so I think the conversation around going through, there's a lot of privilege tied to resources that empower us to actually get through. Not everyone has all the resources. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. So just know that we can't oversimplify the conversation, and there's a lot of uh, trails we could go down there with all of that. But it is important to be just starting with ourselves, to stand in a space of zero judgment for our emotional experience, and to say yes to the self that is asking for something, right? Whether it's to slow down, to be quiet, to have more space, to be still, and then to extend the ask for what you need to others so that you can go through it together. All right, Tina, anything you're seeing that you wanted to speak to or come back to or expand on in the last few minutes here? Or...
Yeah, I think a couple levels of this. So first thing, I appreciate you bringing that up. I feel, for example, I chose to pay insane amounts of money over the course of time to get support for myself. And I fully recognize that was a very privileged experience, even though within that, that also meant that I was making choices. I was making choices about not having savings or this or that or the other thing. It's not saying that I wasn't a millionaire doing this. I will say that. But I will fully say that one of the things I am angry about to this day is that somebody like me had to have a six-figure corporate job to get through the trauma that I had in my system. And I had a fairly easy go of it as a childhood experience. In other words, I am well aware that most people are going to have much larger things to work through. And I know how much money I paid for all of that to get support. So for me personally, it's one of the reasons why it's so important that Hold On is nonprofit. And it's also so important why the people who have been the privileged, just to generically say, white people in this colonialist, patriarchal, etc., we have to heal if we're going to hold the space for everybody else to heal. And I'm not making that, oh, white people are going to hold the space for people of color. I'm not making it one or the other. I'm just saying that if you're in a white body and you have the resources, yes, it can be extraordinarily hard, very uncomfortable. And it's also like imperative that we heal so that we aren't perpetuating the same systems that caused this whole thing in the first place. And we can actually be some of the ones who are available to be helping the collective in the way that it's appropriate for each of us personally. And I'm not going to make any group of people a monolith of helped or not helped or saved or not. It's not that. It's just, if we're going to contribute, we got to heal ourselves. And we really don't want this to be a capitalist endeavor where only people who have six-figure salaries or whatever are able to engage in the work of healing or participating in healing others. So I do think it's a very communal process. I don't remember who it was, but somebody commented earlier about the difference between trying to heal alone and trying to do it in community and how much better it is in community. And they say that when trauma is undergone alone, that's one of the things that sticks it as even more likely to be PTSD or CPTSD than if somebody has support through a traumatic event. And so, yes, all of this, I think, is about, at the end of the day, it's all wrapping around to how can we create spaces? How can we amplify? How can we create awareness and conversations to invite people into the healing journey or in deeper from wherever they're at, or create opportunities for them to be the ones who hold the space? And I think that's the other side of this, is that when we visit our own biggest, deepest discomforts and the things that we exiled most, that's when we create the space within ourselves to hold that for others. We don't wince anymore when someone else rages. If we know our own rage and we know we can handle it and we know what it looks like and we know that it has a beginning and an end, somebody else is raging and we know how to handle it. We know how to create safety boundaries, of course, are important, but the whole point is, whether it's grief, whether it's sorrow, whatever it is, you don't wince the same when you've had to invite it into yourself and re-embody it and reintegrate it into your own experience. And so I think that's a huge part of this conversation as well.
Yeah. I love that. That's beautiful. I'm going to say two things, and then we didn't get to, if you want to stay on for a few minutes, I know we're at the hour, so if you do have to drop, feel free to drop. But just real quickly, I think on this note, if you are going through something and you're seeking resources and support and you're unable to find what you need, know that Hold On Institute's here to help you get the resources you need. If you're going through something and you want support, go ahead and reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll do our best to help you connect to the resources that you need. We don't want you to be alone in whatever it is you're going through. And then the second thing is, we're going to continue this conversation next week with Dr. Hillary McBride and talking about embodiment, because I think these conversations are really one and the same in many ways. And so I would really love to see you all again next week to continue the conversation, talking with Dr. McBride and talking about what does this mean really tactically, just in our bodies, for our bodies, and being bodies. Thanks all.
Have a great rest of the week.